In the previous episode, we reviewed the stories of important men in the Bible who helped establish the nation of Israel. Now let's put everything together to pinpoint the exact date of the Exodus. The Bible gives us two lineages of Jacob that span the Exodus, so we are able to tackle this problem from two angles. The first goes through Jacob's son Levi and extends to Moses, and the second goes from Judah to David. Genesis 46 tells us Jacob, Levi, Kohath, Judah, and Perez were all included in Jacob's journey to Egypt.
These are the names of the sons of Israel, Jacob and his descendants, who went to Egypt, the sons of Levi, Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. The sons of Judah, Shelah, Perez, and Zerah. All those who went to Egypt with Jacob numbered 66 persons.
These verses give us a clear understanding of the names of the people who were born before Jacob's journey to Egypt. We further know that Moses was 80 years old at the time of the Exodus, so now let's figure out how long the Israelites were in Egypt. In the previous episode, we mentioned that modern-day biblical scholars have calculated that time span to be 430 years, but we also clearly demonstrated that number to be false. That there are simply too many years to fit the generations listed in the Bible. Skeptics might say, but the Bible says people lived very long lives in ancient times. Could this simply be an example of that? The answer is no, and it can be proved mathematically. First of all, if we look at the lineage of Moses, the Bible gives us the exact number of years of each person in the genealogy, and the total number of years does not even reach 430.
The years of the life of Kohath being 133 years. The years of the life of Amram being 137 years.
With Moses being 80 years old at the time of the Exodus, there is no way to make the math work for that span of time. Secondly, while very ancient people have been attributed to long lifetimes, the Bible says that after the flood, those lifespans began to shorten dramatically.
My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years.
By the days of David, we know the typical lifespan for a man was 70 years. We find further evidence of the typical generation length of time in the days of Joseph, when we are told he died at the age of 110 years, and just prior to his death, his great-grandsons were placed in his lap. Using math, we can calculate the average generation gap from Joseph to his great-grandson was exactly 37 years, thus confirming that the generational gaps that existed in this time in history would not have been much different from what we see today. In their desperate attempts to pound a square peg into a round hole and make their 1446 Exodus date fit, theologians, who otherwise claim the inerrant nature of the Bible, have put forth the very bizarre missing generations theory to explain these gaping holes in the timeline. The theory goes like this. Maybe God got confused, or maybe Moses forgot to write down some of the names in these two lineages. If we assume the Bible accidentally left off some of the names, we can make the timeline work and the date 1446 BC becomes viable. But this theory is preposterous for two reasons. First of all, the lineage from Abraham to David is listed multiple times in many books of the Bible, including Old Testament and New Testament, and they are always consistent. Are we to believe every ancient historian got wrong the most important genealogy ever? Secondly, and even more convincingly, the books of Genesis and Exodus were written by Moses himself, who claims that his own grandfather Kohath was born before the Israelites moved to Egypt. There simply is no room for missing genealogies. For us to accept that theory, we would have to believe that Moses forgot the name of his own father. This simply is not possible. So what's going on? How did modern Bible scholars, dedicated to finding the truth, arrive at this 430 number if it is false. Let's take a look at how that number was calculated, why it is wrong, and what the correct number is. It turns out there is a single verse in the Bible that is used to arrive at that number, which is Exodus chapter 12, verse 40.
Now the length of time the Israelite people lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of the 430 years, to the very day, all the Lord's divisions left Egypt.
That verse seems very clear and straightforward, doesn't it? Pay attention, because the truth is going to amaze you. First of all, let's point out that no other verse in the Bible offers additional support of this time frame, and nothing in the Egyptian record supports that number either. And looking at the genealogies mentioned in the Bible, it's clear the true number should be much closer to 200 years, not 430 years. So what's going on? Well, the answer is right in front of you. Take another look at that verse. Look closely. It turns out there is a little-known footnote associated with that verse. Do you see it? The footnote says Egypt and Canaan. What is this? Is it possible the 430 years starts with the year Abraham moved to Canaan? That would be 215 years before Jacob went to Egypt, meaning the Israelites were only in Egypt for 215 years. If true, this would close the gap, allowing the genealogies to fit perfectly. This, by itself, is a compelling argument, but there exists evidence that nails the coffin shut on this theory. We need only turn to the first-century historian Titus Flavius Josephus, who wrote in great detail about the Jewish people and the Exodus. Josephus was born in Jerusalem and wrote a 21-volume book titled Antiquities of the Jews. The writing is a complete history of the Jewish people, starting with creation and covering nearly every major event through his present day, which was about 94 AD. Reading through Josephus's account of the Exodus, we find this astounding passage.
They left Egypt in the month Xanthicus, on the 15th day of the lunar month, 430 years after our forefather Abraham came into Canaan, but 215 years only after Jacob removed into Egypt. It was the 80th year of the age of Moses, and of that of Aaron 3 more. They also carried out the bones of Joseph with them, as he had charged his sons to do.
Amazing, it all makes sense. It was 215 years from Canaan to Egypt, which we had already proved previously, and another 215 years from Egypt to the Exodus, for a total of 430 years. This seems incredible that historians have overlooked this clear, emphatic statement and instead cling to misinterpreted dates that do not add up and do not make sense. Josephus lays out the timeline in impeccable, unambiguous terms. He provides convincing proof that the correct interpretation of Exodus 12:40 is 430 years that the Israelites lived in Canaan and Egypt, meaning only 215 years in Egypt. In fact, every ancient document we know of, without fail, gives us a time frame close to 215 years that the Israelites lived in Egypt. The Book of Jubilees, the Book of Jasher, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Seder Olam Rabbah. There simply are no exceptions to this rule. And if this is not enough proof, there is another supporting verse in the New Testament. Paul himself confirms that it was exactly 430 years from Canaan to the Exodus. As he plainly wrote,
Now the promises were spoken to Abraham and to his seed. The law, which came 430 years later, does not invalidate a covenant previously ratified by God.
the law refers to the first 5 books of the Bible written by Moses following the Exodus, which clearly states these writings came 430 years after God spoke to Abraham. These facts cannot be disputed. Josephus and Paul make it clear that educated people of their day understood the 430-year timeline, and it was not until centuries later that people began mistranslating the verses, leading to bizarre timelines that do not add up. So we have now firmly established and locked in part of the Exodus timeline, as well as demonstrated that another part to have been clearly miscalculated. In the next episode, we will zero in on that section of history to uncover the flaws that modern Bible scholars have made as we work to unravel the true Exodus timeline. We will also match up these new dates to the historical record of Egypt, as well as reveal Joseph as an actual historical person in Egyptian history, plus name the Pharaoh of the Exodus and conclusively announce the true date of the Exodus. Stay tuned.